Sup flappers, welcome to another guide video. Today we will be looking at Rosaria and breaking down her kit, starting with some important tips and tricks, then talent priorities, into constellation value before we get into weapons, both for free to play and whale options, and of course artifact choices with main stats and substats to go for. I will be including main DPS Rosaria as well as support Rosaria in this video, so timestamps are included in the description, and I will be making a separate video tomorrow showcasing teams that will work best with her, so subscribe if you are looking for that as well. Anyways, let's get into some tips and tricks. So first and foremost, we have to understand the basics of how Rosaria's kit works with itself. In fact, her talent 1 and talent 2 are indeed able to synergize with your teammates. So using her to support your team, you'd want to engage with your elemental skill to get that crit rate buff for Rosaria, then use her burst skill to buff the rest of your team. This is like a combo string that you definitely need to familiarize with if you want to get the most out of Rosaria in a support, DPS, or a pure support role. Now, moving on to tip 2. Rosaria's elemental skill dashes to your enemies and has only a 6-second cooldown. Use this skill to reposition yourself on the battlefield away from danger without needing to use stamina, as well as engage onto enemies. What will separate a decent Rosaria player from the greats will be how well you can utilize her elemental skill to stick onto enemies while conserving stamina from dodging skills as well. Now onwards to her talent priorities. This is where things get tricky depending on how you will be playing her. From what I tested, Rosaria will be viable in all 3 roles of main DPS, support DPS, and pure support. So if you are building Rosaria to be your main DPS, I'd suggest, of course, going for your auto attack talent first, then your elemental skill, and then finally finishing with her burst skill. But if you are building her as a support DPS Rosaria or pure support Rosaria, I do suggest to build her burst skill first. The main reason being, leveling her burst skill increases not only the initial damage but also the cryo damage over time, which ultimately makes this incredibly worth it due to you not being able to field Rosaria for auto attacks as often as when she is your main DPS. Followed by the burst skill, you should be leveling her elemental skill. This skill at talent level 8 hits for over 300% every 6 seconds. Now that is some thick damage if I do say so myself, and the skill should be used close to cooldown to not only constantly regen particles for Rosaria as well as reposition yourself on the battlefield. The dash part of this skill can be used to gap close onto enemies without burning stamina, as I mentioned in the tips section, so do familiarize yourself with the distance to get the most out of its effectiveness. Moving on to the constellations, and we will talk about this a little more in depth, as for 4-star constellations it is much more accessible than 5-star ones, and this will be really important because you are just that much more likely to end up with more copies of a 4-star, especially when you're chasing after the 5 stars on the banner. Granted, there's always the case where you get a 5-star before getting the 4-star you want, so I guess that's just literally suffering from success. Anyways, let's start with Constellation 1. This is a great constellation, but not worth it if you are only getting this single one. C1 by itself won't do much for Rosaria, so let's continue and see what Constellation 2 is all about. Now, Constellation 2 is quite a bit better. The duration of the ice lance created by Rites of Termination is increased by 4 seconds, which this is her burst skill, and what this essentially does is it increases it from 8 seconds to 12 seconds, and the cryo ticks from 4 ticks over duration of 8 seconds to 6 ticks with the duration of 12 seconds. And this is a great constellation to have, and one would say this is a quality of life addition to Rosaria's kit, but in many cases it will also affect your DPS. More uptime means more cryo ticks, which ultimately means more melt or freeze synergies and less downtime for your burst. Overall, a great Constellation 2 to pick up. So if you're going for Constellation 1, I highly recommend going for Constellation 2 as well. Moving on to Constellation 4. This constellation actually solves a big problem for Rosaria, and that is energy regen. I don't know about you, but personally I was pushing Rosaria to 180% energy regen, and it felt just shy of enough to be comfortable, so having Constellation 4 will make it so your Rosaria is not as energy regen hungry. It seems miHoYo designed Rosaria to struggle a bit with energy regen, and as usual included a paid solution to the problem. So if you're finding that your Rosaria is struggling to keep up with your Bennett's burst or your main DPS burst uptime, them, this Constellation will help greatly with that. Now finally, her Constellation 6. At first glance, it looks good, but to be honest, I was quite disappointed with this Constellation. A 20% physical resistance reduction feels not very impactful for how much it can cost to get a Constellation 6 Rosaria. If you're going to get C6 Rosaria just for this effect, why don't you just save for a C0 Zhongli, who can do the same thing with his Jade Shield. And I understand that this is a stackable effect, meaning you can have Superconduct, Rosaria C6, and Zhongli Jade Shield, and why not just throw in Razor's C4 or something, right? If I remember correctly. But my point here is that it just feels excessive and too expensive for what it gives. I would have wanted to see a constellation that increases Rosaria's burst range or some function constellation, but here we are at Constellation 6, and this is what we got. So now to summarize, Constellation 6 Rosaria is not worth it. Constellation 4 is situational depending on how much you struggle with energy regen, or if you want to make Rosaria your main DPS without missing out on her burst up time. Constellation 2 is a great constellation to stop at, as it gives amazing quality of life, which Rosaria can benefit regardless of being a main DPS, support DPS, or just pure support. Otherwise, I just rock her at C0, as C1 really just is not worth it and is only functioning as a bridge between C0 and C2. Okay, so with constellations out of the way, let's talk about her weapons. Now, from testing Rosaria, it was quite overwhelming with how many options I had, but depending on whether you want to play main DPS Rosaria or support Rosaria, her weapon of choice may differ. So starting with main DPS, we have the Crescent Pike being undoubtedly the best free-to-play weapon available, or if you do not have a prototype on hand, you can go with the Black Cliff Pole, as it's a decent choice as well. Moving into gacha weapons, you can use the Lithic Spear to pair her with 3 Liyue characters, but that will be difficult as one of the best units to pair with Rosaria being Diona is a Mainstat resident. Finally, moving into the paid weapons, we have the BP weapon being a great overall choice for her if you have it available. Rosaria's kit works really well with crit rate, and this effectiveness can benefit her teammates through her passive talent. 5-star weapons such as the Staff of Homa and the Jade Spear are both insanely good, with the Jade Spear edging out due to Rosaria not benefiting from Homa's HP stats as much. So for support Rosaria, the best free-to-play weapon will be either the Prototype Grudge or the Black Cliff Pole, depending on whether you need the additional energy regen or crit damage substat. If your Rosaria does not have Constellation 4, you should aim to have 180% plus energy regen, otherwise you should be okay with around 150%. You will not be auto-attacking as much, so Crescent Pike won't be good here. On to gacha weapons, we have the Favonius Lance, and this is a great choice because for the short period of time you will have Rosaria on the field, you want to get as much energy particles as you can as to not drag down your overall team's DPS. Swap her in, use your skill, use your burst, and swap out is essentially what you are looking to do here. The BP weapon is a decent choice as well, but for support Rosaria, it's not necessary to pay for this weapon because the Favonius Lance will get the job done quite well. If not, then the Prototype Grudge will. So 5-star weapons, you can still use the Staff of Homa, Jade Spear, or if you have now the Skyward Spine, it can really help out Rosaria with her energy regen. But regardless, all 3 are great support options. Onto artifacts, Rosaria can make use of many sets, but mainly have 3 sets you should look to when building her. For main DPS Rosaria, go for the 2-piece Gladiator and of course the 2-piece Bloodstained Chivalry. This is the physical DPS staple nowadays, and you can't go wrong with it for Rosaria. For main stat, you want attack percentage on your sands, physical damage on your cup, and crit rate or crit damage on your headpiece. For support Rosaria, you're looking towards either the 2-piece Blizzard Strayer and then the 2-piece Noblesse combo, or just straight up the 4-piece Noblesse to use that 4-piece effect to buff up the rest of your team even more. You may consider the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set as well if you are running support DPS Rosaria. Main stats here should be attack percentage sands, cryo damage cup, and crit rate or crit damage headpiece. Substats for Rosaria should always be crit rate, then crit damage, followed by attack percentage, and then energy regen or elemental mastery depending on how you are playing her. So that's it for artifact. Now Rosaria is a solid unit, which being cryo also means she can be slotted into many teams. Her quick and decisive playstyle makes her a great pickup for those who enjoy fast-paced gameplay, but do be careful when building her as she requires you to balance stats such as energy regen and crit rate at efficient amounts. So for energy regen, try to keep it between rate 180% and 200%, crit rate around 60%, which through her talent 1 can go up to 72% and transfer roughly a 10% crit rate buff to the rest of your team. And that's it for this video. It was a long one as there was a lot to talk about, but thank you all for watching. Make sure to subscribe for that Rosaria team video coming tomorrow. So until then, stay safe and peace.